Hello, everybody. You probably never heard or seen heard of me before. That's probably just because you haven't been watching the 6 o'clock news. No, just kidding. It was an episode of Cops. Also kidding. I am Nathan Gniewek. It's a Polish name. Don't bother trying to pronounce it. You'll just get a Charlie horse in your tongue. I am interested in helping to take the country that we live in a better direction. I've gotten tired of people trying to tell me what to think, how to think, what their views are, and only what their views are. It's gotten to be a bit much, especially in terms of the practices of government, the reports that media outlets have done on them, economic performance, and even how economics even works. A lot of people either don't care or assume that they know lots of things about both government, especially the Constitution, and the economy, or they just don't care. My aim with these videos is to, I guess, start a sort of mini course on these things, to try and get people at least more aware of them. I am by no means the world's foremost expert on these things. All I know is I do my own research, and I would like to share what I have found with people. Now, I would like to first start off just introducing myself a little bit to let everybody know what I do, where I come from. I grew up in upstate New York. I'm currently living in beautiful upstate Virginia, Northern Virginia, Nova, as people call it. And I graduated from a little place called Christendom College in Front Royal, Virginia in 2010 with a double major in political science and economics and in history. In history, my specialty was early American history, and especially as it pertains to the Constitution and the formation of the colonies into states and the beginning of the United States. And in political science and economics, I specialized in microeconomics. That is the nitpicky side of it, I suppose, like how individuals work and how their actions add up to the totality of an economy at large. Now, I graduated magna cum laude, so at least they thought that I knew what I was doing. I like to think that I know what I'm doing, and I was more or less well reviewed when it came to both my theses. The first of which was on the free market and how it works. Now, I must warn everybody, I do view things by and large through a Catholic prism. Now, I'm not saying that people who aren't Catholic aren't going to find these helpful or informative. I'm just saying that that is where I'm coming from. And what's actually funny is when I was in college, a lot of people who were also, it's a small Catholic college, Christendom. I mean, you don't get any more Catholic than that college was. But I actually a lot of people disagreed with me especially on the free market issues, mostly because of some what I believe to be misguided representations of, or even that they were taught or they believed certain things from a philosophical standpoint that ended up not being scientifically or economically true. Do I believe these people were malicious at heart and were out to destroy the United States? No. Do I think that they're ill-informed and probably need a bit of a tune-up? Probably. And I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I would like to think that I have a few. My first thesis was on the intricacies of the free market, a defense thereof, and a sort of general explanation of things that people often take for granted. I've noticed that a lot of people, when they have even debates, or even more commonly nowadays, conversations with one another. That the big thing that people fail to realize is that a lot of times they may be using the same words but do not mean the same things. Perfect example, I was doing a comedy night at a little place called Epicure Cafe. I know this seems like a shameless plug, so pardon me. But before the comedy night started, a couple of my friends and I were talking about the election and the upcoming presidential election and the nature of the appropriate role of government in the life of an individual. And we were able to keep it relatively civil. But what was interesting is that one person said that he believed that everybody should pay the same in taxes. And he was more of the conservative bent, or while some of the other people started to disagree with him, saying, no, the rich should pay more. This went back and forth for a while until I began to realize, wait a minute, they're not talking about the same thing. It was about the context clues of what they were speaking about. So I said, no, wait a minute, just so everybody knows what we're talking about. David, the first person who talked about that all people should pay the same in taxes, I said, now David, are you talking about people paying the same in terms of an absolute amount? That is, everybody pays $300? Or do you mean everybody should pay the same percentage-wise? He said, oh, of course, I mean percentage-wise. And a lot of people around that discussion started going, oh, okay, yeah, I don't see why that wouldn't be a problem. If you're poor, you pay less, but it's the same rate. And I wasn't going to pretend that I'd fixed the whole problem, because there was still some debate to be had. But we weren't even working on the same concept. A lot of times, when people have a disagreement, it's over something. They may be using the same words to express their ideas, but the concepts behind them are not identical. And in order for people to have a genuine conversation with a free exchange of real ideas to actually get something done, they have to be using the same words in the same context. And I kind of wanted to do something about that for something like that to educate people that I know and people at large about things in the Constitution and in the economy. A lot of times people will use terms that no one has ever heard of, and they just kind of assume that what they're being told is the case, which is dangerous. And so I never did. I don't trust people to tell me what to think. I have to do my own research. And I'm kind of hoping that by doing so, I can help people come to a better understanding of these topics. Now, my general hope, this is becoming a little easier for me, because as of right now, I'm on workman's comp for something that happened. So I'm staying at home. Right now, I'm recording on a Thursday, in the middle of the afternoon when I should be at work. There was an accident, so I'm sort of down and out for a little while, but I should be fine. That every week I hope to put out a new video about something that has to do with either economics, free market, specifically free market economics, the original context of the Constitution, or something about current events. Now, I'll gladly also take questions or suggestions that people want to send to my account, my email account, nathan.gniewek@gmail.com. You can see my name as spelled above on the screen. And I can try to look into that, or see if there's a way I can work a discussion of that topic in. I'll choose a few that come in and try and see which ones are the best to try and mesh with what's going on for the day. I, today, more or less, was just going to use this as an introductory video. But I hope that nobody will mind if I start off, especially given that we have a presidential campaign coming up, if I start off with a brief introduction to the Constitution. Now, a lot of the research that I've done is already done for me, essentially, because, well, I shouldn't say done for me, I did it, is from my second thesis, which was entitled "The United States Constitution: A History and Exposition of Constitutional Terminology as Rooted in the English Common Law Tradition." I got an A on it, so I'd like to think that it's something that was factually correct. And we can start off, just the first thing, I already more or less covered that language is a big thing in, especially when it comes to a constitution. Now I was like, well, that's a very simple statement. Obviously that's true. Yes, but what I mean by that is, for instance, if someone says, yesterday I went out on the bay. If left to stand by itself, you might think that this person went sailing the day before. If he follows up with a sentence, but later my wife met up with me on the Appaloosa, it becomes apparent that he's talking about a recent horseback ride. So we have to understand the respective contexts of words in order to comprehend the message that's being conveyed. This is especially true of written law and more specifically constitutional law. The Constitution of the United States is filled with words which, in every field of law, carry very specific meanings. They are referred to as something called terms of art. That is, something that has a very specific meaning within the I guess you could say, legalese is what people often refer to it as colloquially. And in order to understand the Constitution, and more importantly, what the founders intended it to mean and do, we have to study it in the light of the Constitution itself, the context of the times in which it was formed. And in order to stop the destruction of America as it was founded by today's renegade politicians, I believe that an educated electorate is needed in order to do that. I would like to start just with a brief overview of American legal history and the nature of constitutional law. Now, I would like to clarify that unless someone brings it up, I'm only going to focus some other topic. I would like to focus on those terms of art which I believe in the Constitution are either the most difficult or most frequently misunderstood. Often they're the same thing. But so it probably would not be a terrible thing to give a brief historical overview as to where the Constitution came from and the historical context in which it was formed. Let it suffice to say that during a period of what was known as benign neglect, the colonies in North America, the British colonies, were for the most part left unattended while England was out fighting various wars, dealing with Napoleon or the war. They had all kinds of wars going on at the time over on the European continent. So essentially, the colonies over here were left to themselves. Like, okay, we can deal with this, no biggie. So they eventually became accustomed to governing their own affairs. What's important to the case being made is that the colonists were unwilling to resubmit to the British Crown once its wars were concluded, and when England started attempting to reassert its power via what are considered unjust and often violent means, the colonies resisted, which led to the War for Independence, or some people call it the Revolutionary War. But revolution seems to denote a violent upheaval and radical change in a series of beliefs or practices in a country. And essentially, this isn't really. It was not a revolution in that sense. It was more. You could almost say a conservative fight to keep things as they were. It's like, no, we don't need your help anymore. Thank you. We can take care of ourselves. We want to keep things the way they are. That's not a revolution, properly speaking. So I prefer to use the term War for Independence, but I'll generally know what people mean if they refer to it as the Revolutionary War. So when that war ended in England's defeat, the colonies set up their own government, and that in general, this may seem to be an oversimplification of what happened in American history, but the most rudimentary studies in this field will affirm what was written in this thesis and what I'm speaking here. So I suppose it's sufficient for this purpose. The important thing to know about American law and jurisprudence is that for many years there was little, if anything, that was distinctly American about them. When the colonists arrived in the New World from Great Britain, they took with them much of the English law and legal traditions that were, and those customs associated therewith. The English common law remained with the colonists upon their definitive break with England, because, in a sense, I forget who it was, and I'm kicking myself for not being able to find it again. He was quoted as saying that the American War for Independence was Englishmen rebelling against England's unjust laws. They essentially believed, the colonists in some sense believed, we are the real Englishmen. We are upholding what is genuinely within the spirit and even the written text of English law. They believed that that what they were doing was fully within their right, and they continued on with it unabashedly, and we should thank them for it. In particular, there was one English scholar of common law that the American colonists esteemed above all other secular authorities. He was considered the greatest legal mind that the British Empire ever had to offer, and his name was Judge Sir William Blexton. It's spelled like Black Stone, but his name is pronounced Blexton. Blexton was cited more than any other English or American authority in the Founders' day, and it was his works were the second most cited overall, being surpassed only by the works of Montesquieu. And even then, Montesquieu was cited more for his political theory than his legal prowess, like Blexton. Blexton's most famous work was the commentaries on the laws of England, which essentially served as the groundwork for the United States Constitution. Now, again, because I do my own research and I couldn't necessarily trust what other people were going to tell me, I bought my own copy of it. It's a 4-volume set, and I know it seems like it'll only function as a great bedtime story for being able to put you right to sleep, but if anyone has questions about whether or not what I'm saying is the case, feel more than free to go and look it up in the copies that they have. And there more than likely will be ones at your library, or so you can, if you're really interested, you can buy them online. I got mine online. But his works are what I drew upon very heavily to write this thesis, and in a sense, the founders did much the same, citing his works to form the Constitution. Now, there is a book by John Eidsmoe. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name right. It's spelled E-I-D-S-M-O-E. It's called Christianity and the Constitution, the Faith of Our Founding Fathers, where he states, quote, "Throughout the latter half of the 1700s and the first half of the 1800s, Blexton's popularity in America was uneclipsed. It can be said that that more copies of Blexton's commentaries were sold in America than in England, and his commentaries were in the offices of every lawyer in the land, that candidates for the bar were routinely examined on Blexton, that he was cited authoritatively in the courts, and that a quotation from Blexton settled many a legal argument," end quote. So, I mean, it stands to reason that he was one of the most, if not the most important figure to have influenced our American legal system. So, to start by taking the very first quote from him, Blexton, about the nature of constitutional law and laws in general, he started off by defining something called natural law. And he talked about it and defined it with the following. He said, quote, "Man depends absolutely upon his Maker for everything, and it is necessary that he should in all points conform to his Maker's will. This will of his Maker is called the law of nature. God has so intimately connected, so inseparably interwoven the laws of eternal justice with the happiness of each individual that the latter cannot be attained but by observing the former. And, if the former be punctually obeyed, it cannot but induce the latter. He has graciously reduced the rule of obedience to this one paternal precept, that man should pursue his own happiness. This is the foundation of what we call ethics or natural law." End quote. This was taken from his first volume, which is entitled Of the Rights of Persons. Then he later compared this with something called revealed law, or some people call divine law. And he said that, quote, "Man's folly has I shouldn't say quote, man. I had to insert man's folly, otherwise it didn't make it didn't make sense within the context of the quote. But man's folly, quote, "has given manifold occasion for the benign interposition of divine providence, which, in comparison to the frailty, the imperfection, and the blindness of human reason, hath been pleased to discover and enforce its laws by an immediate and direct revelation." Now, the doctrines thus delivered we call the revealed or divine law, and they are to be found only in the Holy Scriptures. I had to interrupt for a second, say close quote for a minute. Obviously, at that time, England had broken away from Catholicism with Henry VIII in 1534 and formed the Anglican Church, or Church of England. So at this point where he was writing, it was mid-1700s, and obviously they had the Anglican Church is considered a Protestant sect of Christianity, and that's one of the major places that there's, I suppose you could say, a sad division between Catholics and Protestants on that issue, is that Catholics believe that the revealed or divine law can be found not just in the Holy Scriptures, but also in tradition as held and passed down through the ages by the apostles, taken from Jesus Christ. Protestants believe that that the doctrines defined in the divine law are only to be found in the Holy Scriptures. That's a doctrine called sola scriptura, or Scripture only. Now, I'm not going to go into I'm not going to go break down a theological debate. That's not my issue. I'm just providing the historical context where he's saying that they are found in the Holy Scriptures. This is because he takes the Anglican or Protestant angle in his definition of the revealed law. Now, to continue the quote, "These precepts, when revealed, are found upon comparison to be really a part of the original law of nature, as they tend in all their consequences to man's felicity." End quote. This was one of Blexton's criteria for determining whether something was within the scope of natural law. He did not mean for natural or divine law to be taken in a light or transient fashion, stating that, quote, "the law of nature being coeval with," coeval, not E-V-I-L, like, but coeval, like, I guess you could say, in context, coincidental. They sort of overlap. Coeval with mankind and dictated by God himself is, of course, superior in obligation to any other. It is binding over all the globe, in all countries, and at all times. No human laws are of any validity if contrary to this, and such of them as are valid derive all their force and all their authority from this original. Upon these two foundations, the law of nature and the law of revelation, depend all human laws. That is to say, no human laws should be suffered to contradict these." End quote. This is to say that human positive law is to be grounded in the laws of God, be they expressed within the natural or divine law. If they are found not to be in accord with them, then they are not truly laws and may be discarded as invalid. Now, this is something that a lot of Americans have lost sight of over the course of the centuries. I mean, I'm not saying that they discard it entirely. I'm just saying they may not understand that. I suppose this may boil down to the idea that's been pounded at us for decades: the separation of church and state. I'll get to that eventually. That I have a portion of that laying out for future reference. But I think a better way of phrasing it would be distinction and non-conjunction. That is, in American law, what we've taken and done is we make sure that the state and religion cannot become intertwined. That means they cannot be one and the same. There's no problem necessarily with them, I guess you could say, almost holding hands and guiding the people entrusted to their mutual care toward happiness. But that's the major distinction to be made between American law and English law, was that in England, the state is the church is the state. They are, in fact, entirely the same. That's why the monarch of England is, in fact, the head of the Anglican Church, ever since its founding, the birth of the Anglican Church. There was a brief period where there was no monarch, but that got messy for that. I'm again not getting into the doctrinal differences, but but that is how that works. It had worked since the founding of the Anglican Church. By and large, the monarch was in charge, and to this day is the head of the Anglican Church. So that's I would say that's the major distinction that I wanted to just clear up real quick. Again, I will get to the separation of church and state thing in more detail as time goes on, but I'd like to proceed on a kind of very basic level and proceed upward from there. Now, having touched on human positive law as grounded in the laws of God, there's still the question of where constitutional law ranks in this universal legal hierarchy. And it's obviously not divine or natural law, and cannot be considered mere human positive law either, because it does not prescribe or prohibit actions of individuals in society. It is, in fact, instead, law that governs government. And Blexton said that law is, quote, a rule of civil conduct prescribing by the supreme power in the state, commanding what is right and prohibiting what is wrong, end quote. Now, to quote a famous author, his name is Forrest MacDonald. He had a book called A Constitutional History of the United States. He said that, quote, the Constitution meets that definition of law, referring to Blexton's quote, except that it commands and that its commands and prohibitions apply not to private individuals, not to the citizenry, not to the people, but to government. It is, in other words, law that governs government, end quote. So this can lead us to draw certain logical conclusions. First, constitutional law being a subset of human law, and thus it is thus bound to the same limitations in that respect. It must be non-contradictory to the natural and divine laws in order to be valid. However, it is higher than human positive law. It is a higher version of human positive law to which all other human laws must conform. If this were not the case, then why would we have ever bothered to set up a constitution in the first place? It would just have been an unnecessary step. Instead, the founders took great care to hammer out a constitution for the new nation that they were forming, and few could have put it better than an author named M.E. Bradford when he wrote that, quote, in our political system, the fundamental law, the Constitution of the United States, is sovereign, end quote. That is, the quote-unquote ruler of the United States is not a president, is not a Congress, is not the judiciary. God is not the judiciary, but in fact the Constitution. And all members of government are supposed to be subservient to it and what it means. Essentially, if you were to put a colloquial spin on it, Constitution wears the crown. And the best that anyone can do is to serve the Constitution as best they can. There are some more fundamental concepts that have to be discussed in order to interpret constitutional provisions correctly. Now, there's a procedure for determining how a term of art is to be interpreted. There was a booklet put out by the Virginia Commission on Constitutional Government. It was in 1964. My library in school had pretty old stuff. I mean, so it goes like even farther back than 1960. But 64, Yes, was when it was put out, and it had a really good portion of it that it was relatively lengthy, but I'd like to share that because it will come in very handy much later, where it says, quote, "A constitution does not consist of empty words. Words have meanings. The words of a contractual instrument, as applied to particular events or conditions in the minds of the parties at the time of the instrument was agreed to, have a permanent meaning. Such a meaning is necessarily fixed. It becomes, in fact, the instrument itself. To alter it would be to alter the instrument itself. This is true even if some disagreement among the parties themselves led or forced them to have the courts interpret the instrument and judicially establish the meaning for them. If that original meaning, however determined, is to be abandoned, then it must be by the consent of the parties, and the instrument must be formally amended. That is, however the founders meant for the Constitution." I can end quote there. That is to say, I just mean to say, this is a brief explanation, that however the founders meant the Constitution's various provisions to be interpreted and used when they were crafted in 1787 is the way that they are supposed to be interpreted today. They are necessarily unbending, unchanged. They do not morph over time. If they did, it wouldn't be a constitution. It wouldn't be a written constitution. If you write something down, it means for it to be permanent, something to be unchanging. You write something down, it is supposed to be the message you are conveying is now entrusted to that sheet of paper, I suppose you could say. It's like what that message is now unchanged unless someone comes in and makes the change. He has to be one of the parties who originally made the document. So there was the historical context and considerations in regards to the language of legal documents. They're necessary to understand them because we have to know exactly what the context was that the people who made the instrument, in this case the Constitution, what context they were working in order to form the instrument that they were forming. There was a Supreme Court Justice, Joseph Story. He had a work called Commentaries on the Constitution of the United States. He was very authoritative and in some respects was even, I suppose you could say, rendered to be the American equivalent of Blexton. He was a bit of a nationalist, which he saw the United States as one whole nation of the 13 colonies. They were all one instead of being 13 different states. I have a bit of a problem with that, and I'll explain that in historical context later. Just suffice it to say that the individual colonies, then states, viewed themselves as independent, almost nations, that just happened to have a federal government in common. This is why when George III lost the War of Independence with the colonies, he had to sign not one treaty, but 13 different ones, one with every single one of the colonies that had broken away from him. One for Georgia, one for Connecticut, one for New York, one for New Jersey, etc., etc., etc. And so, to pull a quote from Joseph Story, his legal prowess is generally pretty good, but again, I just had that issue with his view of the nature of the states themselves. But still, his law, by and large, was pretty good. He had a quote from his commentaries on the Constitution of the United States. He wrote that about interpretational procedure that, quote, "The first and fundamental rule in the interpretation of all instruments," again referring to legal documents, "is to construe them according to the sense of the terms and the intentions of the parties," end quote. That is, the intent of the lawgiver is the law. If the original interpretation is to be altered, only the parties involved, in the case of the Constitution, the several states, can do so. To claim anything different is to undermine the very nature and purpose of a written Constitution. So, I mean, more or less, that wraps up the context of the Constitution's history and by and large the means of constitutional interpretation that I hope to use to examine the various provisions and terms of art within within the Constitution when I next get to it. I hope thus far this has been informative. I hope that eventually I will be able to make more videos of a similar context. Again, I'll be touching on further constitutional matters, economic matters, and even current events or social matters as time goes on. Again, feel free to send your suggestions. I'll be glad to take a look at them, because I know that there are lots of people who have questions and that they want some kind of answer that I suppose that they're trying to look for. The most important thing let me just say that the most important thing that people have to look for is not what makes them comfortable, but what is in fact true. And this is something that a lot of people have lost sight of, is that if we don't have the truth on our side, then there really is no point in fighting at all. I assume that whoever would be sending me any suggestions on topics to use is in fact interested in finding the truth. And I just want to essentially assist in helping to educate people in the truth about these matters. It has been an absolute pleasure to put out my first video. And again, I hope to do this weekly from here on out. Probably take Christmas off, but can you blame me? So I hope to see you guys again later. And by all means, God bless, and I'll see you next week with any luck. Take care.